You are explaining yourself again to someone who stopped listening before you even started. You can feel it happening in real time. There is a moment, usually about 2 sentences in, where the other person's eyes go slightly flat. Their jaw settles. Something closes behind their face, and you register this. You register it completely, but you do not stop. You go deeper. You add more detail. You reach for the exact combination of words that will finally make them understand, that will tip the scale back toward you, that will get them to revise what they have already decided about who you are and why you did what you did. You are not speaking to a person anymore. You are speaking to a verdict, and the verdict was already written. Here is what they call this: over-explaining, justifying yourself, seeking validation. They will sometimes call it insecurity, sometimes people-pleasing, sometimes a lack of boundaries. The labels arrive easy, and they stick fast, and for a while you carry them around and accept that this is simply some defect you were born with, some soft underbelly of the personality that marks you as someone who needs approval to feel real. But there is something none of those labels account for. There is something underneath this behavior that is not about weakness at all, something that, when you trace it back to its actual origin, not the cultural diagnosis, not the self-help framing, but the raw psychological reality, turns out to be something entirely different from what you have been told it is. The problem is not that you explain yourself. The problem is who you have been explaining yourself to. You were maybe 7, maybe 9, maybe you were 17, and you watched a parent look straight through a perfectly logical explanation as if you had not spoken, and something calcified in you that day. Not a belief, exactly. More like a reflex. An automatic reach for justification that fired before you even made the decision to speak. By the time you were an adult, the reflex had a whole infrastructure behind it. You rehearsed conversations in the shower. You replayed arguments afterward, mentally inserting the better response, the cleaner argument, the version of yourself that would have been impossible to dismiss. You became extraordinarily good at anticipating objections. You could hold 3 different versions of a potential conflict in your head simultaneously and pre-argue all of them before the first word was ever exchanged. Other people called this anxiety. You called it preparation. And here is what the internal monologue actually sounds like when the moment arrives. Someone questions a decision you made about your job, your relationship, your body, your money, your time. And immediately the machinery starts. If I can just explain the context. If they understood what I was dealing with that week. If I say it differently this time, slower, with more of the actual reasoning visible, maybe they will see that this made sense. Maybe they will see that I am not careless. Maybe they will see that I thought about this, that I am someone who thinks about things, that I am not what they seem to think I am. That last sentence is the one that matters, that I am not what they seem to think I am. Every explanation, at its core, is an attempt to influence someone else's internal portrait of you. You are not explaining the decision, you are defending the self. And so you explain. You go long. You provide context that wasn't requested. You add qualifiers, caveats, backstory. And when the explanation fails, when the person remains unconvinced, or worse, looks mildly contemptuous of the volume of your need to be understood, you feel something specific, not sadness, not anger, a particular species of shame that sits low in the chest because you have just revealed how much their opinion of you costs you. You have shown your hand to someone who is not playing the same game. You have tried to suppress this. You have stood in rooms and bitten the words back, and felt the pressure of the unexplained thing sitting hot in your throat. You have practiced not defending yourself, have called it discipline, have read enough about emotional intelligence to know that the impulse to over-explain is something to be managed. And so you manage it, visibly, effortfully, and somehow that effort is its own kind of performance, another way of announcing how much you care about being perceived correctly. Because here is the part that does not get named. You cannot just turn this off. Not because you are weak, because the explaining is not the disease. It is the symptom of a question that has never been fully answered for you. Not the question everyone assumes. Not am I lovable? Am I good enough? Do I belong here? Those are real questions, but they are not the specific one. The specific one, the specific, uncomfortable question that this pattern keeps circling back to is this: if I do not make my interior life visible and verifiable, if I do not prove that my reasoning is sound and my intentions were good, will anyone actually believe I exist in good faith? That is the question underneath the explaining. Not am I enough, but am I legible? Whether anyone will take the trouble to read you accurately if you do not do the translating yourself. Over-explaining is not the right word for what you do, and the fact that you have accepted it says more about how thoroughly other people's frameworks have been installed in you than it does about your actual behavior. Over-explaining implies excess, that you are giving more than is needed, more than is appropriate, more than is warranted by the situation. It assumes there is a correct amount of explanation, and you have simply exceeded it. But that framing already accepts the premise that your reasons do not deserve air. What you are actually doing is something far more precise. You are attempting to close an information gap between your internal experience and another person's perception of your actions. That is not excess. That is a very specific form of care. Care about accuracy. Care about being understood correctly, rather than just being tolerated. The problem is not the behavior. The problem is that you have been deploying this care toward people who are not interested in closing that gap. They are not confused about you. They have decided about you. And you cannot explain your way out of a conclusion that was never built on evidence. The word is not over-explaining. The word is misplaced precision. Tykes point to where this actually comes from. Asterisk. The psychological origin of this pattern is not insecurity in the simple pop psychology sense. Insecurity suggests a generalized wobble, a chronic low-level doubt about your own value. What you have is something more targeted. It is a very specific, very trained sensitivity to the risk of being misread. In early environments, and this applies whether the environment was overtly critical or simply emotionally unpredictable, you learned that the gap between your intention and other people's interpretation of that intention was dangerous. Not because you were doing anything wrong, but because the adults in your life were not consistent interpreters. The same behavior got different responses, narrows to the exact. The same explanation landed differently depending on mood, context, external stress that had nothing to do with you. So you became a close reader of that gap. You developed an almost professional-grade awareness of when you were being understood accurately and when you were not. This is not a disorder. This is intelligence applied to an unstable environment. The function of explaining yourself at its origin was protection. It was the most rational available response to a world where being misread had real consequences. It worked sometimes. It bought you safety sometimes. And the nervous system, which does not distinguish between the original environment and the current one, kept the strategy running long after the original threat was gone. You are not explaining yourself because you are weak. You are explaining yourself because at some point, explaining yourself kept you safe, and the body does not easily unlearn safety behaviors. The origin of this pattern is not weakness. It is adaptive intelligence operating on outdated data. Asterisk point 3. What the judgment reveals about the people doing the judging. Asterisk 4ing yourself too much. When someone treats your need to be understood accurately as evidence of some deficiency, it is worth spending exactly one moment examining what that judgment requires them to believe. It requires them to believe that the correct posture is not caring whether people understand you correctly, that the healthy response to being misread is indifference, that emotional legibility is a sign of weakness rather than a sign that you are someone with enough self-awareness to know when a gap exists between your intent and its reception. People who are genuinely comfortable with themselves do not find detailed reasoning threatening. People who have nothing to prove do not experience another person. That's explanation as irritating or excessive. The contempt that sometimes gets directed at people who over-explain is almost always coming from people who have decided, for their own psychological reasons, that needing to be understood is a form of neediness that should be controlled or hidden. They have learned to perform self-sufficiency, and your visible investment in being understood correctly violates that performance. Their judgment tells you one thing only, that they have no interest in accuracy. They want a version of you they can manage easily. And the fact that you are not manageable in that way, the fact that you keep insisting on the actual complexity of your reasons, is not your failure. It is your inconvenience to them. The people who judge you for explaining yourself are people who have decided convenience matters more than truth. Point 4. The concrete advantage. There is a specific and measurable advantage that people with your particular pattern carry into the world, and it almost never gets named because the framing is always about the cost and never about the return. The advantage is this: you have developed an exceptionally refined model of the gap between internal experience and external perception. You know with unusual accuracy what it feels like to be misunderstood. And because you know what that experience is, from the inside, you are unusually capable of recognizing it in other people and of doing something about it. People with your pattern tend to be extraordinarily precise communicators when they are in environments that actually reward precision. They give context that other people forget to give. They anticipate the objection before it is voiced. They build arguments that account for the audience's prior assumptions rather than ignoring them. These are not incidental skills. These are skills that matter enormously in in law, in education, in any domain where the gap between what you mean and what someone else understands can have real consequences. The trait is not a liability. It is a tool that has been misdirected toward people who do not value what it produces. Point 5. The difference between this trait suppressed and this trait used. When you suppress the impulse to explain yourself, when you bite it back, call it growth, perform the version of confidence that does not need to be understood, what actually happens is not that the need disappears. What happens is that it turns inward. You run the explanation to yourself. You construct the argument in your own head, over and over, trying to close a gap that no longer has a recipient. You become your own jury, and you retry the case indefinitely because the need for accurate understanding was never addressed. It was just hidden. This is the misuse of the trait, not the explaining itself, but the explaining itself, but the explaining that people who have already closed the verdict, or the explaining that happens only in the privacy of your own mind, with no one on the other end. The trait used, actually, correctly used, looks like this. You are in a room with people who are genuinely trying to understand a complex situation. You have the language for the nuance. You can articulate what others are feeling around without being able to name. You build the case. You close the gap. You do not over-explain because there is no excess. You are giving exactly as much as the moment requires, and the moment finally is built to receive it. The difference is not the behavior. The difference is the audience. When you stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided, you do not become quieter. You become more precise about who is worth your precision. The first thing to change is the internal label, because the label shapes the experience before the experience even happens. Right now, when the impulse arises, when you feel the pull toward explanation, the label running underneath it is some version of "here I go again," some version of the diagnosis, the slight self-disgust of someone who has been told that what they are doing is too much, and who now carries the judgment as an internal narrator. Replace that with something accurate, not something flattering. Accuracy, not flattery. When you feel the pull toward explanation, the internal language that corresponds to what is actually happening is, I am noticing a gap between my intent and how this might be landing, and I am deciding whether to address it. That is the full sentence. Not I am about to embarrass myself by needing to be understood. Not I am doing the thing again. You are noticing a gap, and you are deciding. The decision itself becomes a different kind of moment when you frame it that way. Instead of fighting the impulse from a place of shame, you are making a deliberate evaluation. Is this person someone who will use this information to understand me better? Or is this person someone who has already drawn their conclusion and will use this information to confirm it? That evaluation does not take long. You already know most of the time. You have known for years. You just overrode the knowledge with the reflex. The replacement language is not a mantra. It is not a positive affirmation. It is simply a more accurate description of what is actually happening inside you, which gives you back the agency to choose rather than react. Shift 2. The environment audit. Not all environments are equally hostile to the way your mind works. There are rooms where the precision you bring is a liability, where efficiency is prioritized over accuracy, where the social norm is confident assertion without much supporting architecture, where detailed reasoning reads as weakness or hesitation. These environments are not wrong. They are just wrong for this trait. Knowing the difference matters more than trying to make yourself fit. Spend a moment mapping your actual life. Think about the relationships, the professional contexts, the recurring social situations where you most often feel the pressure to over-explain or the shame of having done it. What do those environments share? They probably share a low tolerance for complexity. They probably share a preference for the appearance of decisiveness over the reality of careful thought. They probably contain people who have decided that not needing to explain yourself is proof of strength, rather than proof of incuriosity. Now, map the other side. Think about the relationships where your detailed reasoning has landed well, where someone has said, "I hadn't thought about it that way," and meant it. Think about the context where the gap-closing skill you have developed has actually served both you and the other person. These environments exist. They may be fewer than you would like, but they exist. And the project is not to transform yourself into someone who functions equally well in every environment. The project is to stop using hostile environments as the primary evidence about what you are capable of. You are not failing in the right environments. You have been succeeding in the wrong ones. Shift 3. The response protocol. Shift 3. The response protocol. Shift 3. The response protocol. The raised eyebrow that signals too much. You need exactly 2 sentences available to you internally, not to say out loud. To say to yourself because the internal response is the one that determines whether you contract into shame or remain solid. Sentence 1. This person is interested in the gap between my intent and their perception, and that is information about what they can receive, not about whether my reasoning is valid. Sentence 2. I do not need to close this gap with this person. That is it. Nothing more elaborate. The first sentence names what is actually happening. It is a legibility problem, not a truth problem. The second sentence releases you from the obligation to keep trying, not because you are giving up, because you are recognizing that explanation requires a willing recipient, and a willing recipient is not present. You do not need to announce this. You do not need to perform the shift. You just need to run the 2 sentences and let the pressure drop. Shift 4. The ownership statement. Very. There is a version of you that has stopped treating the need for accurate understanding as a liability. This version is not louder or more confident in the conventional sense. It is not performing security. It has simply stopped apologizing in the 10,000 small ways that people apologize for being complex. This version knows something clearly, that the impulse to explain itself accurately is not a flaw that needs to be managed. It is evidence of a mind that cares about truth, that finds the gap between intention and interpretation genuinely uncomfortable, that would rather take the time to close that gap correctly than let a misreading stand. That is not weakness. That is a standard, a specific, non-negotiable standard about how you want to exist in relation to other people. Honestly, legibly, with the actual texture of your reasoning on the table. Ownership does not mean you explain yourself to everyone. It means you have stopped being ashamed of the fact that accurate understanding matters to you. You stopped letting people convince you that the desire to be understood correctly is evidence of insecurity rather than evidence of integrity. You carried a trait without apology and without excess, not because you have finally conquered the impulse, but because you have stopped treating it as the enemy. The person who owns this trait does not explain less. They explain to fewer people, more completely, without the desperation. The desperation was never part of the trait. It was a product of shame. Remove the shame, and what is left is simply someone who communicates with precision, because imprecision, to them, is a form of dishonesty. There is a larger pattern at work here, and it is worth naming it directly before this ends. You have spent a significant portion of your life measuring yourself against a standard of ease, of someone who moves through rooms without friction, who makes decisions without second-guessing, who exists without the persistent, low-grade labor of ensuring they are being read accurately. You have watched other people perform this ease and concluded, repeatedly, that something is wrong with the machinery inside you, that the effort it takes you to feel understood is evidence of some core deficiency, that if you were more certain, more settled, more secure, you would not need the explaining at all. But that standard was not designed for the way your mind works. It was designed for a different kind of mind, a mind that is less attentive to the gap, less bothered by imprecision, less troubled by the distance between what it means and what gets received. That mind exists, but it is not better than yours. It is just differently calibrated, and somewhere along the way you accepted that calibration as the norm and yours as the deviation. You were wrong. There is no neutral standard. There are only different standards, and some of them fit certain minds better than others. Here is what is actually true about you right now. You are someone who has spent years developing a sensitivity to misunderstanding that most people do not possess. You know what it costs to be read inaccurately. You know this from the inside, with a specificity that other people can only approximate. That knowing has been painful, and it has been expensive, but it has also produced something real. A capacity for precision in communication, a willingness to do the work of being understood that most people outsource to assumption, and a very clear internal compass about when you are being seen versus when you are being managed. You are not too much. You have been too much for the wrong people, in the wrong rooms, explaining yourself to people whose verdict was already written before you opened your mouth. The right people, and they exist. They are not a fantasy. Do not need you to defend your reasoning before they will extend you good faith. They bring curiosity to your complexity rather than impatience. They ask the second question rather than settling for the first impression. They understand that detailed reasoning is not the same as anxiety, that caring about accuracy is not the same as needing approval, that the person who takes the trouble to explain themselves fully is doing something that requires courage, not comfort. You are not the problem. You have been answering the wrong question in the wrong room to the wrong audience for a very long time. You do not owe anyone an explanation for being someone who needed to be understood. And the people who already know that about you never needed you to explain it.